you mentioned the Sufis, so I want to take this chance as a segue to our final chapter, which is Sufism in the Hanbali school. And I think that in daily life, Tasawwuf and its meanings and its content have a far greater impact than a lot of the things that we were talking about before, for the scholar and the common Muslim. Okay. Let's go into the Sanad here and see where does Tasawwuf, how does it rise? And Tasawwuf, I mean, it's a general meaning of inner directedness towards Allah. Imam Ahmad Zarruq, he just defines it as that. So the word doesn't need to exist. Certain practices don't need to exist. It's merely the inner directedness with one's intent in his actions towards Allah and nothing else. And that's Imam Ahmad Zarruq's intention. So I'd like you to speak about Tasawwuf in the Hanbali heritage. And also I'd like you to speak about its application to ourselves and our daily lives in this context, being in a world where doubts are spread around, and sometimes doubts are best combated with dhikr, not necessarily with knowledge. Shahawat are thrown at us. Sometimes the Quran and dhikr also are a better response to that. So I'd like you to speak on that.
Yeah, well, certainly, I believe that the Islamic Awakening, and I am very vocal about this within the circles that I am active in, and I am active in a lot of circles because I don't believe in partitions, but also I am active in circles that are sort of hardcore Salafi circles, and I believe about how deprived the discourse, the Muslim discourse, the Islamic discourse has become of that moisture, and how dry it has become because of this aversion to the concept of Sufism and Tasawwuf. And no matter how much you say that, you have talked about, the different stops in the Hanbali madhhab, and you mentioned Wahhabism before, and my thoughts about this. And honestly speaking, I don't believe, I believe in synthesis. I don't believe in the sort of swinging between thesis and antithesis. I don't take strong positions against or for people. I believe that reality is rational. I believe that certain historical development happened because they were meant to happen, because there were efficient and sufficient causes for them to happen. So I believe that there is the action and reaction. But my synthesis, I don't call people Wahhabis, honestly speaking, about the Najdi strand of Hanbalism, because this is where Hanbalism has become sort of, or is perceived to be anti-Sufi. The Najdi strand of Hanbalism. First of all, this is not basically an illegitimate child of Hanbalism. It is a legitimate child of Hanbalism. So we were talking about the Asanid yesterday or before, and we said that like someone like Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Wahab, Ibn Abdul Wahab, for instance, he learned from Sheikh Abdullah ibn Ibrahim ibn Saif, who learned from al-Ba'li. They learned from Abi al-Mawahib. There is a lot of Ba'li. So he learned from Abi al-Mawahib ibn Abdul Baqi al-Ba'li, who learned from his father and Ibn Balban. That's why the Najdi scholars like to teach Akhsar al-Mukhtasarat a lot, because it was written by Ibn Balban. And that's fine, because it's loyalty to your teachers. And Ibn Balban, learned from Al-Muflihi, Al-Wafa al-Muflihi, and Al-Wafa al-Muflihi learned from Al-Hajjawi, and Al-Hajjawi learned from Al-Shuwaiki, and Al-Shuwaiki was Shihab ad-Din al-Shuwaiki, or Shihab al-Shuwaiki, and Shihab ad-Din al-Shuwaiki learned from Al-Askari, that is Shihab ad-Din al-Askari, so Shihab al-Shuwaiki and Shihab ad-Din al-Askari. And he learned from Ala al-Mirdawi, and he learned from Abi Sha'ar, and he learned from Ibn al-Laham, and he learned from Ibn Rajab, and he learned from Ibn al-Qayyim, and he learned from Ibn Taymiyyah, and then Ibn Taymiyyah from Ibn Abi Umar, Ibn Abi Umar from Ibn Qudama, and Ibn Qudama we talked about, Ibn al-Manni, Abu al-Fath ibn al-Manni, Abu Bakr al-Daynuri, Abu al-Khattab, Abu Ya'la, Al-Hasan ibn Hamid, etc. After Hasan ibn Hamid, Ghulam al-Khallal, and Khallal, and al-Marruzi, and Imam Ahmad. So it is a legitimate child of Hanbalism, but they have what I believe sort of an indefensible aversion to Sufism, or to some extent aggression towards Sufism. The departures, and there, the Najdi scholars are not all one thing. There are different strands of Najdi scholars, and believe me, there are many who are moderate. Maybe they are not particularly famous or prominent. There are many who are moderate. But you also have to understand that whether you're Najdi or Egyptian, you're going to be different from Indonesian scholars, for instance. The environment has an effect on people. Mm-hmm. But the Najdi scholars and this sort of position against Sufism, I believe it is indefensible. I believe that if there were significant departures, forget about the names and attributes now, Athari and Ash'ari. I don't think that there was much departure there. Sometimes the way the presentation, I have a little issue with the presentation. I dislike how some people present these issues and how some people stress them, and the sort of unmeasured exposure of the masses to them. I disagree with this, but in terms of departure in doctrine, it is not that much. But in terms of in terms of al-asma, bab al-iman, al-asma, al-iman wal-kufr, there is a little bit of excessiveness in this. There is a little bit of excessiveness in the sort of their approach to bid'ah. It is ironically not a Taymiyyah approach at all. It is an exaggerated Shatibi approach. An exaggerated Shatibi approach. Shatibi himself was a lot more strict when it comes to Bid'ah and Sunnah than Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance. But that's an exaggerated approach. And then the other departure that has been very consequential is that basically position towards Sufism. This is a departure from the Hanbali tradition that has been a lot warmer to Tasawwuf. And a lot accepting, a lot more, accepting of Tasawwuf. The ranks of Hanbalis are full of Sufis. We consider, who's going to be more Hanbali than Harawi and Jilani, for instance? Ibn al-Jawzi had his critique of Tasawwuf, but Ibn al-Jawzi was not anti-Sufi. Ibn al-Jawzi is a great wa'az, but he had, and people of different backgrounds and different orientations, they have their criticism of departures, whether these departures from the pure Sufism were because of philosophical Sufism, because there are different sort of phases of Tasawwuf. The first phase of Tasawwuf, or the pure Tasawwuf, then came the sort of the psychological Tasawwuf that stressed, stress was the focus was moved from Zuhd and etiquettes and adab and so on to the states and the psychology. And then there was another development, which is the philosophical tasawwuf, and people had different criticisms, and many times are warranted, but what is unwarranted and what is harmful is basically a wholesale disavowal of a tradition that is so integral to Islam. Because the tazkiyah has come to be known as the sciences of tasawwuf or the path of tasawwuf. So we can't do away with that.
In the Hanbali framework, is tasawwuf a personal practice, or does it have any communal element to it? As it's developed, the Majlis al-Dhikr has become one of the main focal points of the practice of tasawwuf for many communities, and its benefits are sort of visible. You see people who would not regularly do a certain adhkar and dhikr by themselves, but when presented with a group and then maybe some socialization afterwards and some food, have come to easily practice it, leading them in their homes to slowly do this themselves. Is there any precedent for this in the Hanbali school?
And in fact, Ibn Taymiyyah does talk about Majalis al-Dhikr approvingly.
As like tasbih in unison, or qasaid and adhkar and those in unison?
In unison is the issue here. People can agree or disagree over this, but majlis, to sit down together and make dhikr, if you add in unison, that is when the disagreement starts. But there, honestly speaking, I do not believe that this is a bid'ah, personally, but this is a fiqhi disagreement.
Of course, yeah.
Not a aqdi disagreement. And that is where we have to draw the line. This is not, haqq and batil. This is not, it's not even bid'ah or sunnah. It is just a fiqhi disagreement.
Yes.
And different people from different madhhabi backgrounds, they may have different thoughts about this. I personally don't believe that this is, I believe in the superiority of أن تدعو ربك تضرعا وخفيا ودون الجهر من القول بالغدو والآصال. So the sort of the individual, the personal, the individual one, ذكر or جمعية مع الله عز وجل. This is, or togetherness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I believe that this is superior, but I believe that when people come together and sit together, this is established from the Sahaba. No one can argue about this, that to have majlis dhikr. The only thing is that in unison, like if we all make dhikr and we all remind each other of Allah and we make tasbih and tahleel and so on, if you add in unison, then we can disagree and we can say that, okay, this is a valid fiqh disagreement. I believe it's not a problem. I personally believe it's not a problem. If you believe it is, okay, it's a valid fiqh disagreement.
And the reason that I bring it up is that while on the totem pole of knowledge, it will, as you said, it's a fiqhi matter that is on that, pivots on that unicity or the unison of the voice. But in community life, it sticks out. Right, it sticks out, and its impact and effect, and that's why I bring it up. Because sometimes the thing is really a non-issue in fiqh, but amongst the common Muslim, it becomes a big deal, right? Because of either their shock at it, either at the shock of seeing it, or the benefit of the benefit of its fruits. So even though we would say that, yes, on a fiqhi matter, we have no problem either way with the positions, and we have this too in the Malikiyya, that there are Malikiyya that could say, no, that we don't do this, right? And so it's a fiqhi matter, but
there are some Sufis, by the way. There are some turuq that do the singular.
Yes, that's true, and they don't, like the Naqshbandiyya is famous for not accepting the loud adhkar, and even there are some turuq from the subcontinent that do not even have a mawlid. Okay, so there are geographical elements as well. But the reason I bring it up is because it's one of those matters that is in the books it would be far'i, but in the reality of community life and personal lives, people's personal lives, it becomes a big deal, right? And it's one of those interesting matters that is inverted in terms of its reality in the books versus its reality in actual real life that we live. And that's why I brought up that subject. And I think that I think it's one of the things that people should become educated on, because I think many times people, when they're exposed to something that they have never seen before, get a great shock, right? And their shock of that translates to them that this is we don't even know if you're on Ahl Sunnah anymore, right? And so that sometimes, and that produces an imbalanced response, which is books this big to defend a mas'ala that really did not need more than 1 or 2 pages. So that's one of the issues between tasawwuf and ilm that I think was important just to bring up, at least for the sake of bringing it up. But also speak to us about the impact of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jailani in the Hanbali school, and has his order, and I don't know if it was in tariqah with a bay'ah in his time. I don't know that. If maybe his sons, I believe, initiated that. His children initiated that. Could you speak to us on the concept of that?
Since we're talking about this, I had mentioned yesterday that Sheikh Uthman ibn Marzouk, who came to Egypt, tried to make a link between him and Abu Ya'la. Actually, I was thinking about this like a long time ago, and I was trying to make a link between him and Abu Ya'la al-Saghir. So I made a mistake yesterday when I was talking about it. It's actually Abu Ya'la al-Saghir, not Abu Ya'la al-Kabir. That I can't establish the link, but I was saying that most likely they have come to see each other and to know each other. But Sheikh Uthman ibn Marzouk, his basically Hanbali impact on Egypt did not last. It was Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Jamma'ili whose Hanbali effect lasted. Sheikh Abdul Qadir and his children, Sheikh Abdul Qadir, is Sultan al-Awliya. The Hanbalis and non-Hanbalis recognize him as Sultan al-Awliya. Sheikh Abdul Aziz ibn Abdul Salam talks about, people's karamat having been reported to him through singular reports, except for Sheikh Abdul Qadir, his karamat is established through tawatur. At least Sheikh Abdul Aziz ibn Abdul Salam says that. So Sheikh Abdul Qadir does have an impact on the course of tasawwuf. We know that Sheikh al-Harawi rahimahullah had an impact also on Hanbalis, because he is Hanbali. Manazil al-Sa'irin, the commentary Madarij al-Salikin, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah owes much to Sheikh al-Harawi, and he keeps on saying how much he owes to Sheikh al-Harawi, and a lot of people in the Sufi path owe a lot to Sheikh al-Harawi. But Sheikh Abdul Qadir's effect may have been stronger and greater, and sometimes it is not because one person is less or inferior, but also your location makes a difference, and the time makes a difference. So Sheikh Abdul Qadir was in Baghdad during that time where Hanbalism was blossoming in Baghdad, close to the end, but still stronger blossoming. So contemporaries, like Abul Fath ibn al-Mani was his contemporary, Ibn al-Jawzi was his contemporary. He learned from Al-Khattab, also Samurri was his contemporary in Baghdad, and all of the people who came to visit Baghdad came to know Sheikh Abdul Qadir. And like I said yesterday, that Imam ibn Qudama and Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi, they spent the first 40 days of their time in Baghdad with Sheikh Abdul Qadir, hosted by Sheikh Abdul Qadir. And they basically took the Hanbali way from Sheikh Abdul Qadir. You can't really separate, and I understand that there is like the Sufi tariqas and the that have their own sanads, but sometimes your fiqh and tasawwuf get mixed together, and for Sheikh Abdul Qadir it was mixed together. Now Yusuf ibn Abdul Hadi ibn al-Mibrad, he basically mentions his sanad to Sheikh Abdul Qadir through Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, and so that comes the same sanad that we talked about yesterday. In fact, the Yusuf ibn Abdul Hadi come later, died in 909, but would take his sanad through Ibn Qayyim, through Ibn Taymiyyah, through Ibn Abi Umar, through Ibn Qudama, and then from Sheikh Abdul Qadir. Now, everyone who came to Baghdad during this time, and we said that the people who came to Baghdad during this time, they took tasawwuf to Sham and Harran, and then they took humbleism to Sham and Harran, and from Sham to Egypt, and certainly people took Sheikh Abdul Qadir's way, whether they subscribed to the tariqa or not. Sheikh Abdul Qadir had effect on Qadiri Hanbalis and the non-Qadiri Hanbalis in terms of organized tasawwuf versus non-organized tasawwuf. But most of the Hanbalis are of the non-organized tasawwuf, at least the contemporaries, and certainly because most of the Hanbali Asanid now are Najdi, and there is this.
Yeah. It's an interesting point actually that Sidi Ahmed Zarruq brings up in his book on Qawaid al-Tasawwuf. He says something very interesting. He said, the Sufi alone is the best, right? He's at his best. However, when they get together, they stop forbidding wrong, right? Because there's so much love in the gatherings, and no one wants to ruin the momentum, right? And ruin the mood, the mizaj, by forbidding wrong. So it's very interesting that he says that, how there is organized tasawwuf and there is solitary tasawwuf, and how he says that they're at their best when they're individuals, ashkhas scattered around, right, and interacting with the other emzija of the Muslims, the other mizaj, or the mizaj is like the vibrations almost, or the moods of the Muslims, as opposed to when it's a group of people all being Sufis. He said he has a hesitation there because they tend to not want to upset that vibration or mood, and therefore would not forbid the wrong. And so munkarat come into their circles and nobody says anything. So this is Imam Ahmad. So when you mentioned organized and non-organized, it reminded me of that point by Ahmed Zarruq, which is a very interesting point. Now, you also mentioned the Asanid. I want to move on to a conclusion. If you don't have anything more to say about tasawwuf, I think how can we implement that in our daily lives is a different topic than tasawwuf in the history of the Hanbali. Our school, our focus in this podcast has been the Hanbali school and its history. But if you do have any final comments on tasawwuf in general.
I think that we cannot afford basically to ignore that part of our tradition and that heritage. I think that this praise of tasawwuf by some of our greater imams like Shafi'i and so on, we have to be aware that criticism of certain Sufi practices or certain Sufi individuals, we have to have that criticism of Sufis, we have criticism of fuqaha and criticism of muhaddithin and criticism of everyone, so that we maintain the purity of the path and the purity of the practice. So, and this basically self-critique is very important. Anyone who wants to practice tasawwuf must practice self-critique and must be aware of the Qawa'id al-Tasawwuf by Sheikh Zarruq rahimahullah. Because there is much to learn from Qawa'id al-Tasawwuf by him. Emphasis on basically the Sharia is important. Emphasis on clarity versus symbolism, because symbolism led, although aphorisms are beautiful, but certainly excessiveness in symbolism without clarity can have its impact and can be detrimental. So you will find that Harawi, for instance, liking Abu Sa'id al-Kharraz because of his linguistic finesse and favoring him over al-Junayd, for instance. I like al-Junayd more. I like simplicity more and straightforwardness more. It's part of Islam. Purity, transparency, simplicity, it's part of Islam. So I think emphasis on this, emphasis on the first generation as the model, emphasis on Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi an al-Munkar, emphasis also on, Sunnah versus Bid'ah. The fact that some people exaggerate in basically are sort of exaggerate in the scope of bid'ah. It should not basically make us negligent of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, "Man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fahuwa radd." We really need to pay attention to that. Imagine if the Sahaba were not vigilant about that. Imagine if there was a little bit of departure at the time of the Sahaba from mainstream, because when you start to add things and change things, like a little departure at the beginning can result in enormous departure now. And we would have not been able to sit to recognize each other's practices. And the distance between us would have been like the distance between different denominations and other religious traditions. So I think that with emphasis on these things, we can avail ourselves of that essential part of our heritage.
I agree with that. I think the matter should become simplified. The symbolism oftentimes bothers it. I know it bothers me whenever I see any group really starting to look separate from the ummah, or starting to focus on superficials, right, of the matter. Actually, it obstructs tasawwuf itself, right? Tasawwuf itself is something that you almost want to be more hidden about your ibadat and your dhikr than be visible with it in a certain sense, right?
It is what many people said, haqa'iq and rusum and arzaq, the Sufism of realities, the Sufism of ritualism, and the Sufism of gains, material gains.
Well, that was definitely what many in Mauritania were fighting against, and said that it has simply become a profession and a way to gain a lot of gains. So it's getting late, but let's go to the 2 points of the conclusion. Very simple conclusion. The first is a simple question.
محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل